Rafiq, a milkman in the bustling town of Zainabad, had a reputation for delivering milk across town, but his reputation wasn't entirely clean. He was known as much for his shortcuts and quick schemes as he was for his milk. Rafiq was one of those men who always wanted just a bit more money, more land, more respect. But he was skilled at hiding his greed behind a mask of charm. The story began one early morning, with Rafiq making his way down the cobbled paths that connected the houses of his customers. He carried 2 metal cans full of milk, swinging them lightly as he whistled a tune. Little did his customers know that each morning, Rafiq added water to his milk, just enough to save himself an extra liter or 2 to sell later at the market. It was a trick he had perfected over the years. But that morning was different. Rafiq had a plan, one that would allow him to make far more than his daily profits. He'd overheard a merchant at the town square talking about a royal celebration in the nearby kingdom. The merchant boasted that anyone selling milk in such quantities would make a fortune since the kingdom needed gallons upon gallons for the feast. Rafiq's mind buzzed with excitement. If he could manage to get a few extra gallons together, it could change his life. He could buy new clothes, maybe even a new cart, or add some gold coins to his savings. But there was one problem. He didn't have enough milk to fill such a large order. That night, Rafiq lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as he pondered his options. He knew he couldn't simply water down the milk any further, or he risked being caught by his customers. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on a small, dark wooden cabinet at the far end of the room. That cabinet held the only thing that could help him reach his goal, a stash of powdered milk that his late grandfather had left him. Rafiq hadn't touched the powder in years. His grandfather had told him that it was meant for emergencies only, as the powder had strange properties. Don't use it unless you have no other choice, his grandfather had warned in a hushed tone, his wrinkled hands pressing the cabinet closed. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Rafiq saw this as the opportunity of a lifetime. So, late that night, he crept over to the cabinet, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the small, dusty container. Opening it, he caught a faint smell of something musty and metallic. With the powder in his hands, he felt a strange sensation, almost as if the powder pulsed with a hidden energy. He shook off his unease and told himself it was all in his head. After all, this powder would make him rich. So, without further hesitation, he began mixing it with water, blending it into the milk until it was thicker, richer looking, and deceptively creamy. The next morning, Rafiq set off to deliver his enhanced milk. With each clink of his milk cans, a rush of excitement coursed through him. He imagined the money he'd make, the lavish life he'd live. As he approached his first customer's house, an old woman named Nanny Bibi, he forced a smile, holding back his anticipation. But as he poured the milk, he noticed something strange. The milk seemed to thicken more with each drop, taking on an almost unnaturally glossy sheen. Nanny Bibi narrowed her eyes as she took the milk, sniffing it once, then twice. "This milk smells different today, Rafiq," she murmured suspiciously. Rafiq chuckled nervously, waving her concern away. "Just a bit fresher today, Nanny Bibi. Maybe the cows grazed on better grass this week." Nanny Bibi grunted, casting him a wary look. But Rafiq hurried away before she could question him further, moving quickly from house to house, ignoring any strange glances his customers gave him. As he continued his deliveries, an odd sense of paranoia began to creep over him. Rafiq couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The milk, as he poured it, seemed to swirl with an unnatural thickness, and he couldn't ignore how some customers' cats wouldn't even come near the milk bowls after he poured the new mix into them. That night, Rafiq tried to shake off the lingering feeling of unease, chalking it up to nerves. But when he lay down to sleep, he couldn't get comfortable. His mind buzzed with flashes of Nanny Bibi's questioning look, the strange texture of the milk, and the cat's peculiar reactions. As dawn approached, Rafiq finally drifted off, only to wake suddenly in a cold sweat, his heart pounding wildly. He had dreamt of his grandfather, standing over him with a stern, accusing gaze, warning him. Some shortcuts cost more than gold, Rafiq. He sat up, his hands clammy. For the first time in years, he was genuinely scared. He pushed the dream aside and told himself it was nothing but a product of his guilty conscience. But as he reached for his milk cans that morning, he froze. The milk inside was bubbling and hissing quietly, almost as if it were alive. Rafiq's heart thundered in his chest, and he took a hesitant step back. Could his greed have unleashed something terrible? Let me know if you'd like to continue this suspenseful twist in The Greedy Milkman. Each chapter will build more mystery around the consequences of Rafiq's decisions. Rafiq's hands trembled as he looked at the milk cans hissing quietly. His first instinct was to think it was a trick of the mind. Perhaps he was still groggy from his restless sleep. But no, the noise was real. The milk, which had been still and thick the night before, was now bubbling softly, its surface rising and falling as though it had a life of its own. Rafiq's mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it's just souring, he thought, though he knew milk rarely spoiled overnight, especially not like this. He forced himself to take a closer look, leaning in cautiously to sniff the milk. A pungent smell hit him, earthy and slightly metallic, like damp soil mixed with rust. He pulled back, choking on the stench. "Get it together, Rafiq," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. If anyone else noticed something was wrong with his milk, it would mean trouble for his reputation and his profit. But what truly unnerved him was the memory of his grandfather's warning. Some shortcuts cost more than gold. He took a deep breath, ignoring the whispering dread that had taken root in his mind. If he didn't move quickly, he'd miss the morning rush of customers, and today was too important to waste. He tightened the lids on his milk cans, hoping the strange bubbling would go unnoticed, and set off into the town. As he made his way down the narrow streets, the air seemed heavier, pressing down on him as he dragged his cart along. He passed familiar houses and greeted familiar faces, but something was different today. Eyes lingered on him longer than usual, their faces painted with suspicion. He tried to smile, to appear calm, but each stare added to the knot forming in his stomach. His first stop was at Malik's house, a large, stone-fronted building with a beautifully carved door. Malik was a wealthy merchant, known for his sharp business sense and sharper tongue. He was also one of Rafiq's most valuable clients, paying extra for what he believed was the purest milk in town. Today, however, Malik seemed distracted, his brow furrowing as Rafiq poured the milk into his large brass jug. "Rafiq, what's this?" Malik asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "The milk looks different today. Thicker somehow." Rafiq forced a laugh. "Oh, Malik bhai, maybe it's just the new feed I gave the cows. Makes the milk richer, they say." Malik didn't look convinced. He swirled the milk around, watching it cling to the sides of the jug in a way that normal milk never would. He took a hesitant sniff, his nose crinkling as he examined Rafiq with a raised eyebrow. "You're sure nothing else went into it?" "Nothing at all," Rafiq replied, his voice betraying just a hint of nervousness. "Just the finest milk from my best cows, I promise." Malik shrugged but kept a wary eye on Rafiq as he closed the door. As he walked away, Rafiq could feel the tension building, his heart pounding faster with each step. Had he made a mistake using his grandfather's powder? What if Malik, or worse, other customers, started questioning the quality of his milk? But the unease Rafiq felt wasn't just from worry over his clients. There was something about the milk itself, the way it seemed to throb with an unnatural thickness, the strange, earthy smell. It felt wrong, as if he'd tampered with something that didn't want to be tampered with. The day dragged on, each stop bringing another questioning glance or raised eyebrow. His last stop was at Nanny Bibi's house again. The old woman was waiting on her porch, her keen eyes watching Rafiq as he approached. She said nothing as he poured the milk, her eyes narrowing as she studied him with a strange intensity. "Nanny Bibi, your milk," he said, forcing a smile. The old woman nodded, but didn't take her eyes off him. "Rafiq, do you know why your grandfather stopped using that powder you've been mixing?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Rafiq's heart skipped a beat. How did she know? He hadn't told anyone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. Nanny Bibi's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "Oh, I think you do. I saw the powder in your bag this morning, and I know its history. "That powder has been cursed, Rafik. Your grandfather once tried to use it to cheat, just like you're doing now. But he learned his lesson the hard way." Rafik's palms were clammy, and he swallowed hard. "Cursed," he repeated, trying to sound skeptical. But deep down, he knew she was telling the truth. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind, louder and more urgent than ever. "Yes, cursed," she said, her voice growing sharper. "It was made from the earth beneath a sacred tree. They say the ground around that tree holds a spirit that doesn't like to be disturbed. Your grandfather tried to sell milk mixed with that powder, thinking he could make a fortune. But strange things started happening. Cows wouldn't produce milk. Milk turned sour overnight, and the people who drank it, they fell ill, their skin pale, their strength drained." Rafik felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered the cats avoiding the milk bowls, the strange bubbling and thickening of the milk. He'd thought it was just paranoia, but now it seemed as if the powder was reacting, taking on a life of its own. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice came out weak and hollow. "Nanny Bibi, it's just milk. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with it." But Nanny Bibi's face remained grave. "You should know that your greed will cost you, Rafik. It always does. Return that powder to the earth, or you'll pay a heavy price." Rafik backed away, mumbling an excuse as he hurried down the road. Her words rang in his ears, but he brushed them aside. This was just an old woman's superstition, he told himself. There was no curse. He would sell this milk, make his fortune, and forget all about this nonsense. But as he walked back to his small house on the edge of town, the sky began to darken, a thick layer of clouds gathering overhead. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Rafik's steps quickened. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something dark was lurking just beyond his sight, waiting. That night, as he lay in bed, the air grew heavy and thick, pressing down on him like a weight. He tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't rest. Every sound, every creak of the old wood in his room, sent a shiver down his spine. He closed his eyes, but the darkness only seemed to deepen, swallowing him whole. And then, he heard it, a low, soft whisper, coming from the corner of his room. A voice, quiet yet full of menace, calling his name. Rafik. He shot up, his eyes wide with fear, his heart racing. The room was empty, but the whisper lingered, echoing in his ears. Return it or suffer. Rafik clutched his blankets, fear gripping him as he realized the curse was very real, and it was coming for him. Rafik lay frozen in bed, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. The voice that had whispered his name was gone, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. He tried to convince himself it had been a dream, just a trick of his tired mind. But he knew, deep down, that what he'd heard was real. The curse had started, and it wouldn't stop until he paid his debt. He spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, every shadow in his room stretching and twisting into sinister shapes. He pulled the blanket over his head, but no amount of fabric could shield him from the fear clawing at his heart. When dawn finally broke, he was exhausted, his skin pale and clammy, dark circles haunting his eyes. As the first light crept through his window, Rafik forced himself out of bed and stumbled over to his milk cans. He hesitated before lifting the lids, afraid of what he might find. Yesterday, the milk had bubbled and thickened unnaturally, and he dreaded what it might look like now. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself and opened the first can. A gasp escaped his lips. The milk wasn't just thick anymore. It had turned into a strange, sludgy substance, dark and foul-smelling. It reminded him more of mud than milk, with clumps of something that looked almost like plant roots swirling within. The smell was overpowering, a rotten, earthy stench that made his stomach churn. He recoiled, covering his nose and mouth with his hand, his mind racing. What is this?" he whispered, horrified. He'd never seen anything like it, and a sick feeling washed over him as he realized he couldn't sell this to his customers. Not only would they know he'd tampered with the milk, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this substance was dangerous. A sharp knock on the door jolted him out of his thoughts. His heart jumped as he hurried to answer it, pasting a shaky smile on his face. It was Raymond, one of his regular customers and a close friend of Malik's. Rafik cursed under his breath. He hadn't expected visitors this early, and the state of the milk had thrown him off. "Rafik, you're looking terrible," Raymond exclaimed, his eyes scanning Rafik's pale face. "Didn't sleep well, I guess?" He laughed, clapping Rafik on the shoulder in a friendly way. "Anyway, I'm here for my order. Malik told me your milk's richer than ever these days." Rafik's stomach dropped. He didn't want to pour Raymond the cursed milk, but he also knew he couldn't afford to lose a loyal customer. Desperate, he glanced at the tainted milk cans, an idea forming in his mind. Maybe he could just scoop off the top layer, the part that looked relatively normal. He hesitated, but he could feel Raymond's gaze on him, growing impatient. Of course, Rafik stammered, forcing a strained smile. He quickly ladled a bit of the clearer milk from the top, hoping it wouldn't have the same strange effects as the rest of it. He handed the container to Raymond, his hands shaking slightly. Raymond accepted it with a smile and paid Rafik, tipping him extra with a friendly wink. "Keep up the good work, my friend. My family can't get enough of your milk." As soon as Raymond left, Rafik slumped against the door, his mind racing. What if the curse had infected all the milk, even the parts that looked normal? He shuddered, trying to push the thought away, but he couldn't escape the gnawing guilt that was taking root in his chest. The day dragged on, and each delivery he made only deepened his sense of dread. Some customers commented on the milk's thickness, while others eyed him with suspicion, as if they sensed something was wrong. But the worst came late that evening when Rafik returned to Malik's house. Malik was waiting for him outside, his face pale, his mouth set in a hard line. His wife, Yasmin, stood behind him, holding their young daughter, who looked strangely weak, her skin pale and her eyes glassy. "Rafik," Malik began, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you put in our milk?" Rafik's heart sank. He glanced at the girl, who was listless, barely able to keep her head up. "Malik, I don't know what you mean," he stammered, avoiding his gaze. Malik's eyes narrowed. "My daughter drank your milk this morning, and ever since, she's been sick. She can't keep anything down, and she's grown weaker by the hour." Yasmin even tried to drink some of it, but she couldn't bear the taste. He held up the milk container Rafik had sold him, and Rafik's stomach twisted as he saw the dark sludge coating the inside. "This isn't milk, Rafik," Malik growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's poison." Panic welled up in Rafik's chest, and he held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Malik, please. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It was just a little mix to make the milk richer. I swear, I didn't know it would do this." Malik's glare grew colder, his fists clenched at his sides. "A mix?" he spat. "Do you think my daughter's life is a joke to you, Rafik?" Rafik stumbled back, shaking his head frantically. No. I'll make it right. I'll get her a remedy. I'll do whatever it takes." But Malik stepped forward, his face twisted in anger and betrayal. "If anything happens to my daughter, Rafik, I'll make sure the whole town knows what kind of man you are. And I'll make sure you pay for it." Without waiting for a response, Malik turned on his heel and marched back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Rafik stood there, feeling as though his world had come crashing down around him. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, closing in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streets were empty, but Rafik felt as though he were being watched by countless unseen eyes, judging him, condemning him for his greed. He stumbled back to his small house, the whispers from the night before haunting him with every step. They grew louder, more insistent, echoing through his mind. Return it or suffer. Return it. By the time he reached his door, he was nearly out of his mind with fear and desperation. He knew what he had to do. He had to return the powder to the earth, just as his grandfather had warned. It was the only way to lift the curse before it destroyed him and everyone around him. Grabbing the small container of powder, he set off into the dark night, guided only by the faint glow of the moon. He made his way to the outskirts of town, where an old, gnarled tree stood, its roots stretching deep into the earth. It was the tree his grandfather had spoken of, the one from which the powder had come. Rafik knelt beside the tree, his hands shaking as he began to dig into the earth, creating a shallow hole at its base. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a cold wind, chilling him to his core. As he poured the powder back into the ground, he felt a strange energy leave his body, as though the curse were being sucked away, pulled back into the earth where it belonged. He covered the powder with soil, patting it down until there was no trace left. The whisper stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. Rafik sat back, breathing heavily, hoping, praying that the curse was finally lifted. But as he turned to leave, he felt a chill creep up his spine. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches of the tree, and a low, ominous voice filled the air. "It's too late, Rafik," the voice intoned, heavy with menace. "The price must be paid." Rafik froze, his blood turning to ice. He had returned the powder, but he realized now that his actions had set something in motion, something that could not be undone. And as he stumbled back toward town, he knew that the curse was far from over. Rafik's feet stumbled as he made his way back to his small house on the edge of town. The chill of the night air seemed to press against him from all sides, and each shadow felt like it harbored unseen eyes, watching, waiting. His heart hammered, the strange voice from beneath the tree echoing in his mind. The price must be paid. But hadn't he done enough? He had returned the powder to its rightful place. What more could this curse want from him? The village lay silent as he hurried through the narrow alleys, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind churned with images of Malik's daughter, pale and listless, her young face twisted in pain. Guilt gnawed at him, and with it, the growing terror that something worse was coming. He reached his door, fumbled with the latch, and shut himself inside, the walls of his modest home feeling like a thin barrier against the darkness beyond. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, shadowy figures standing outside his door, their faces indistinct, watching him with hollow, accusing eyes. The minutes dragged by like hours, each creak of his house's old wooden frame making him jump. Just as he began to think he'd lost his mind, he heard it, a faint tapping at his window. Rafik froze. The tapping was soft, almost polite, but it filled him with dread. He lay still, his breath shallow, hoping the noise would stop. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a relentless thudding. His heart raced, and he forced himself to sit up, straining to see through the darkness. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, he approached the window, peering through the foggy glass. At first he saw nothing, but then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. 3 figures standing outside, cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured by darkness. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green light that seemed to pierce through him. Rafik stumbled back, his blood running cold. He hadn't seen their faces clearly, but he recognized their posture, their menace. It was as if these shadowy beings were here for a purpose, as if they had come to collect a debt he hadn't even fully understood when he incurred it. The figures remained silent, unmoving, and Rafik could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. His mind raced back to his grandfather's stories about the curse. It was said that those who tampered with the earth's power would find themselves haunted by ancient spirits, the debt collectors, as they were called, beings that ensured a balance by taking whatever was owed. "No, no, please," he whispered, backing away from the window, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He tried to close his eyes, to shut out their presence, but he could feel them seeping into his thoughts, their cold voices filling his mind with sinister promises. "You've broken this sacred trust, Rafik," a voice whispered from behind him, sending a jolt of terror through his body. He whipped around, but there was no one there. Yet the voice continued, low and haunting, resonating from all sides. "The earth does not forgive. The life you've taken will be reclaimed." He could barely breathe as he felt a creeping numbness spread through his limbs. He stumbled to his knees, clutching at his head, trying to force the voices out. But the whispering grew louder, filling the room like a storm, relentless and merciless. "We come for balance. they said, their voices overlapping, echoing off the walls. Your greed has tipped the scales, Rafik. Now the cost must be paid in life. No, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I returned the powder. I did everything I could. Please, leave me alone. The shadows in the room deepened, thickening like smoke, until he could hardly see. He could feel their icy fingers reaching out, brushing against his skin, leaving trails of cold fire in their wake. The presence was suffocating, wrapping around him like a noose, closing in tighter with each breath. Just as he thought he would faint from the pressure, the darkness receded, pulling back as if granting him a brief reprieve. He gasped for air, clutching his chest, his heart pounding with the remnants of fear. But even as he regained his senses, he knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, giving him time to understand what he'd done. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, to find someone who could help him. But as he opened it, he saw the figures standing just beyond the threshold, their faces hidden in shadow. They stared at him in silence, their green eyes glowing like embers, filling him with a cold sense of finality. Rafik, one of them said, its voice barely a whisper, yet heavy with power. You have taken from the earth, and the earth must be fed. The words hit him like a blow, and he sank to his knees, shaking his head in denial. Please, I didn't know, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know it would come to this. But the figures remained impassive, unmoved by his pleas. The balance will be restored, Rafik. You cannot escape it. Rafik was desperate, his mind racing for a way out, but he found none. The curse wasn't something he could talk his way out of or bargain with. It was ancient, unyielding, a force older than his understanding. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, one of the figures leaned forward, its face emerging from the shadows just enough for Rafik to see. Its skin was pale, almost skeletal, with deep hollows where eyes should have been, replaced instead by the unearthly green glow. It grinned, its smile sharp and menacing. There is one way to end it, it said, the words dripping with malevolence. You must sacrifice or be sacrificed. Rafik's heart sank. Sacrifice? What did that mean? He thought of Malik's daughter, of the people he'd lied to, of his own family legacy tainted by greed. Was there a way to undo the damage? Could he offer something that would satisfy these vengeful spirits? But before he could answer, the figures began to retreat into the darkness, fading like smoke. Their voices lingered, echoing in his mind, chilling him to the bone. The choice is yours, Rafik. Offer what you value most, or the earth will take it from you. With that, they vanished, leaving him alone in the quiet, his mind reeling with their parting words. What did he value most? His wealth? His own life? He sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands, fear and regret crashing over him in waves. As dawn broke, he knew what he had to do. The only way to stop the curse was to make a true offering, to give up the one thing he had clung to so desperately, his greed. He would sell his cows, give up his business, and live humbly, returning to the earth what he had taken. But as he made his way toward the village square, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The spirits had said sacrifice. Would giving up his business be enough to satisfy them? Or would they demand something far more precious? Only time would tell, but Rafik couldn't shake the feeling that his debt to the earth was far from repaid. And with each step he took, he felt the weight of the curse pressing down on him, a constant reminder that he had a price yet to pay, one that would haunt him until his final breath. Rafik walked through the quiet streets of his village, the morning sun casting long shadows that seemed to cling to him, whispering of secrets and consequences. His heart felt as heavy as the very earth beneath his feet. He thought of the spirits' words from the night before, their sinister promise echoing in his mind. Offer what you value most, or the earth will take it from you. He clenched his fists as he approached the village square, where a handful of his fellow milkmen gathered, ready for the day's trade. He had come to a decision. He would sell his cows and give up his business, even if it meant starting over with nothing. If he had to live in poverty to appease the curse, then so be it. At least he would be free from the haunting voices and the terror that had filled his nights. The other milkmen greeted him as he arrived, their friendly smiles quickly fading as they noticed the grim look on his face. Raymond, his old friend and regular customer, was the first to approach, his brows furrowed in concern. "Rafik, are you all right?" he asked, his tone laced with worry. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rafik forced a tight smile. "I need to. I've made a decision, Raymond. I'm selling my cows. I won't be delivering milk anymore." A murmur spread through the crowd. The milkmen exchanged puzzled looks, clearly taken aback by his sudden announcement. Raymond looked at him as though he'd lost his mind. "But, Rafik, why would you do that? You're one of the best milkmen in town. Everyone loves your milk." Rafik swallowed hard, unable to meet his friend's gaze. How could he explain? He couldn't tell them about the curse, the voices, or the vengeful spirits that haunted his nights. No one would believe him, and even if they did, they would never understand the fear that had taken hold of him. This was his burden to bear alone. "It's complicated," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I have to do this, Raymond. It's the only way." Raymond shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "You're making a mistake, Rafik. Whatever is going on, we can help you. You don't have to give up everything." But Rafik only shook his head, his mind made up. He sold his cows one by one that day, the money exchanging hands feeling like lead in his palm. Each sale felt like a loss, a piece of himself slipping away. But he clung to the hope that this sacrifice would finally free him from the curse.